Good afternoon, everyone in Southeast Asia. Good morning and good evening to everyone across the globe who are tuned in today. Welcome and hello from Manila. My name is Rocky Guzman. I am the Deputy Director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, or ARIA, and I am pleased to be the moderator for today's webinar entitled Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or what we call BBNJ, and its prospects for Southeast Asia. Today, we focus on a very exciting topic. You'll be hearing a lot of this term we call BBNJ and its implications in the region. I know many people are keen to know more about this topic, especially right after the heels of the conclusion of the BBNJ agreement last March. So we look forward to hearing what this really means for Southeast Asia in this webinar. But first, to give some context on BBNJ, the subject matter of this historic treaty, which you'll hear more about, is the area that covers the high seas and maritime zones beyond countries' national waters. This is the largest habitat on Earth, which is home to millions of species. However, just over 1% of this area is protected in a space which spans nearly 2/3 of the world's oceans. Scientists have long advocated for a level of protection here, and that's necessary to ensure a healthy ocean. But now here comes the new legally binding agreement or international instrument on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which was agreed upon on March 4. The BBNJ agreement was developed under the auspices of the Law of the Sea Convention and marks the culmination of nearly 2 decades of work. Now, this agreement seeks to enhance the international legal regime concerning BBNJ and is vital for achieving a lot of global ocean-related goals and targets, including the pledge to protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. This panel now will look at a variety of topics related to BBNJ, including access and use, conservation measures, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building, both globally and within the context of Southeast Asia. Through our speakers, we'll get to see what this historic ocean treaty means for the region and beyond. Now, before we start, we'd like to acknowledge first the organizers of this event, colleagues from ARIA. This event is also in partnership with the United Nations Environment Program and Law Asia. We thank our esteemed panelists today for their insights and expertise. And please note that after this panel session, we will have a Q&A, although you may ask your questions anytime by typing them to the question box below in your screens. Please also be informed that we are live over Facebook and LinkedIn through the ARIA page, so you can check that out even after this webinar. Now, without further ado, let's start with the panel. We are honored to have our first panelist, Elizabeth Mendenhall. Beth, as we call her, is an assistant professor in the Departments of Marine Affairs and Political Science at the University of Rhode Island. Her PhD is on international relations, and her research focuses on the drivers and mechanisms of change in global ocean governance, especially on the Law of the Sea Convention. Her research work has focused on the BBNJ negotiations, marine plastic pollution, and nuclear military transit at sea. Beth, thank you very much for being here despite the time difference from Rhode Island. We really appreciate it. And now, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rocky, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me and for putting this session together. I'm share my screen. Oh, got 2 monitors, so I've got to get it right here. And I ask for your forgiveness to any cognitive slowness because it is 6:07 a.m. for me. Can you see the full screen or can you see the next page?
It's on presenter mode, Beth.
Okay, let me switch it. The challenge of working with 2 monitors. How about now?
Yeah.
Better?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
Wonderful. So yeah, as Rocky said, my specialization is the drivers and mechanisms of change in global ocean governance, but specifically UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, of which the BBNJ agreement is an implementing agreement of. So it needs to be fully consistent with UNCLOS. It's nested under UNCLOS. So that's what brings me to study these negotiations. And I would also just remind you once again that my PhD is in international relations. So I'm a political scientist, not an international lawyer. And that often shapes or helps explain for the audience my kind of perspective and approach to treaty making and treaty design. So I have attended all 6 of the BBNJ negotiation sessions. They're 2-week chunks, and you call them the IGC, the Intergovernmental Conference. And I have many publications, and I work with a group of co-authors, and one of our ultimate goals is to publish a database of interventions at the BB&J negotiations. So basically, we have a very big and detailed spreadsheet that records who said what about which topics and when, that we hope can be a useful resource for researchers into the future. But we cannot publish this database and make it available to you until the negotiations are really completed, which in a sense they are. The treaty has already been finalized, but it has yet to be adopted. And the president of the negotiations, Rena Lee, has requested that we maintain kind of anonymity for interventions and speakers until that point. So look forward to that, more to come. So in this talk, I'm sort of setting the stage for the larger discussion, and I'll mostly focus on how we got this treaty earlier this month, its basic content, and what issues remain controversial until the end. And then I'll sort of start the shift to considerations for Southeast Asia in a general way that I think the subsequent speakers in the Q&A will build on. So negotiations, of course, took place at the United Nations. The first formal session was in September of 2018. So we had 5 years of intermittent negotiations. The process to get this treaty, however, started in an ad hoc, informal, open-ended working group in the early 2000s. And I want to make it clear that before the negotiations began in 2018, 2 major sets of issues were already settled or already decided. The first is the 4 elements of the BB&J package that would be included in the treaty, which I'll have a slide in a couple of minutes that lay those out. But basically, the agenda was set before the negotiations began, and that agenda sort of constrained what was talked about and what could be included in the treaty. And the second thing is this important proviso that the BB&J treaty should not undermine existing instruments, frameworks, and bodies. And I emphasize this second point, that the BB&J cannot undermine existing mechanisms and bodies, because the popular news media has been reporting on this treaty as if it has some kind of hierarchical relationship with other elements of the ocean governance regime. But it really doesn't. It's designed to sort of fit in between and fill the gaps between existing regional and sectoral organizations, but it has to find ways to kind of reach out and connect with and perhaps coordinate with what already exists. So this was a close thing. We were initially scheduled, or the UN General Assembly had authorized 4 negotiation sessions, but we didn't have a final treaty by IGC4. And so a 5th session was scheduled for last fall, which itself failed to conclude a treaty. And so the resumed 5th negotiation session took place at the end of February, beginning of March of this year. And like I said, it was a near thing. We almost did not finalize the treaty during this session, even though we were already 4 weeks over time. So these are my notes from the last night of the session. So the session was scheduled to end at 6 p.m. on Friday, but negotiations pushed through the night. And I'm sitting throughout these negotiations in the back of conference room 6 here, which you can see this view on the top right. It's a photo I took. And the further you got along in the sessions, the more the discussions were taking place in closed sessions that observers could not attend, or the president's consultations. And so over on the left, this is what information we got as observers, what issues they were taking up in the closed consultations. And so this is going through Friday night into Saturday morning. I include the photo on the bottom right because everyone's eating out of the vending machines throughout. Most people do not have time to go back and refresh themselves at their hotels. I deeply regretted not bringing a toothbrush with me. But this notes at the end at 7:37 p.m. when President Lee asked for another 30 minutes, and they took about an hour and a half. That was sort of the key dramatic moment, because up until this point, around 6 p.m., 7 p.m., the rumors trickling into the room that observers were picking up on and sharing was that the negotiations were going to fail, that they had foundered upon a set of issue areas that had been contentious throughout the negotiations, including funding mechanisms, benefit sharing, voting thresholds. And so we really thought that this was going to fail. And it was very much a last minute compromise that achieved the completion of this treaty. So where we are now is the treaty has been finalized. Negotiations will not be reopened. The draft, or I keep calling it the draft text. I need to change it in my head. It's the final text of the BB&J treaty. We have that, but it still needs to be adopted by the Intergovernmental Negotiating Conference. And that is anticipated to happen this June, at which point the treaty will be open for signature and ratification. And of course, states have to go through their own domestic process of ratification. The threshold for the BB&J treaty to enter into force that was decided upon was 60 ratifications. After we reach 60 ratifications and the treaty enters into force, a year later, the Conference of Parties will meet. And that's an important moment for implementation because one of my general kind of takeaways from these negotiations and the finalization of the draft treaty was that a lot of the major issues were pushed to the COP for decision making. So not only will the Conference of Parties have to adopt its own rules of procedure and clarify the modalities for the operation of other BB&J bodies, which I'll talk about in a bit, but it has to make a lot of important decisions about what implementing this treaty actually looks like. But those decisions are driven by states, both acting as members of the Conference of Parties and making proposals to the COP about, for example, designating new marine protected areas. So while we've accomplished a lot, and reading over the treaty, it really is a remarkable achievement. It's the first new implementing agreement since the mid-1990s, but there's a lot to come in terms of making good on the commitments in this treaty and actually translating it into protection for the ocean, more conservation, and sustainable use. Before I get into the details, I want to establish that the treaty applies to areas beyond national jurisdiction. And certainly this includes the high seas, the light blue in this map, the area of the water column and sea surface that's beyond the exclusive economic zone. But areas beyond national jurisdiction also include the international seabed, which is called in UNCLOS the area. And this is something that was sort of in the background the whole time, but not really talked about explicitly. And I think in terms of the popular understanding of the treaty, I've been really distressed to see the frame High Seas Treaty catch on, because the inclusion of the area, and I know our third speaker will address this in terms of relationship with the International Seabed Authority, it's going to create a lot of challenges for implementation because the boundaries of the area are not yet settled in most parts of the globe. So countries have outstanding extended continental shelf claims, which you can see in this map on the left. And there's major questions like, will the United States be able to make our extended continental shelf claim, which we're planning to do? You can see over on the image on the right. And this matters because the BB&J treaty applies to the area. It does not apply to extended continental shelves, but it's unclear where the area begins and ends. And it's going to take decades to resolve that boundary. And this is an issue for Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific as well, because like many parts of the planet, there are unsolved or unresolved continental shelf claims. So these are the four main issues that the BB&J area treaty covers. These were decided upon in 2015 before the negotiations began. And the two things that this image or this slide is missing are the institutional arrangements, so the bodies created by the treaty or that will be created through the COP to actually animate or activate the rules for these four issue areas. And then also the so-called cross-cutting issues, topics like what states will get special consideration in the implementation or operation of these provisions, or how will traditional knowledge be treated throughout the treaty. So there are some issues that span all four of these issue areas. Institutional arrangements will be relevant for activating the rules in all four of these issue areas. But the main content of the treaty concerns these four topics. And I sort of group them in my head in terms of the environmental issues on the bottom row versus the issues that are more about access and economic justice and ownership and kind of rights to share benefits and participate in uses of the ocean. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, and I don't expect you to necessarily absorb all of this, but these are the sets of topics that really obstructed the finalization of the treaty throughout the last couple of negotiation sessions. These are the things that we had to have large compromises, connected compromises on to reach finalization of the agreement. And so there are especially significant parts of the treaty where it was very unclear how things like voting thresholds were going to end up until those final days, Friday and Saturday. So for example, on voting thresholds, there was a lot of push for consensus-based decision-making in the Conference of Parties to do things like designate marine protected areas or make decisions about benefit sharing, the precise modalities of sharing benefits when marine genetic resources produce a very valuable and profitable product. And so, throughout the treaty, there are areas where it's consensus, but then a voting option. But the voting thresholds are different depending on the topic you're talking about. And so these kinds of mechanical implementation issues really obstructed completion of the agreement until the end. And I'm happy to talk about any more of these issues and why they were controversial and how they were resolved in the Q&A. Like I said, with the should not undermine part of this agreement, the BB&J agreement does not have a hierarchical relationship to other instruments, frameworks, and bodies, which means that when it comes to conservation and sustainable use beyond national jurisdiction, existing institutions like regional fisheries management organizations, the International Maritime Organization, the International Seabed Authority, what they're doing still matters, and their processes are not going to be superseded or replaced by what the BB&J agreement adds. In terms of the institutional architecture, the BB&J agreement, the treaty, creates all of these bodies. The exception is the Finance Committee. I have that in parentheses because the Conference of Parties will have to create that later on. All the other bodies are established through the finalization, adoption, and entry into force of the treaty. And I highlight the Conference of Parties and the Scientific and Technical Body because in my mind, these are the ones that have the most significant functions. The Conference of Parties has a lot of decision-making functions. And like I said, that was sort of one element of finalizing the agreement is that, well, if we can't make the decisions here in the negotiations, let's kick that decision-making to the Conference of Parties, with the view being that the Conference of Parties will be a smaller group of states that have committed to the BB&J rights and duties, the mechanisms in the BB&J, and so decision-making might be easier there. The Scientific and Technical Body, you can sort of compare it a bit to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf created by UNCLOS, in that it will be populated by scientists who are acting in their personal capacities rather than a national capacity. They won't represent states. The Scientific and Technical Body was given a lot of things to do in the BB&J agreement, but very little of it really counts as decision-making. It's more like recommendations and advice to the COP or to state parties. So before I get into a couple of slides thinking about implications for East Asia, these are some kind of big takeaways about how the BB&J agreement will function. So when it comes especially to the environmental aspects of the agreement, like conducting environmental impact assessments, proposing and designating marine protected areas, those processes are very state-driven. Several negotiation sessions ago, some states were pushing for, the Scientific and Technical Body. Maybe they should be evaluating EIAs, or maybe they should be proposing area-based management tools in protected areas. But over time, those proposals to empower third-party mechanisms really got whittled down to just the remainder of recommendations and consultation and being involved in the review process. And even when it comes to restrictions on marine genetic resources and accessing them, which is my third point here, it's states that have to do the main oversight. And so throughout the treaty, you see a lot of instances where states have to do things relative to the actors under their jurisdiction and control, which is a bit ambiguous in terms of what state to private actor relationship you're talking about. But in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, a lot of this is flag state jurisdiction. And so private actors, their behavior will be shaped, but through states domesticating the BB&J requirements. And of course, if you want to do protection of an area around fishing, for example, if you want to protect an area of the high seas from fishing, shipping, and mining, say, the BBNJ agreement can't do anything about that without coordinating with existing instruments, frameworks, and bodies that are already have the jurisdiction over those particular activities. So there is a lot new, there is a lot significant, but the BBNJ, it really has to be driven by states, and it has to coordinate, consult, collaborate, basically reach out to and interface with existing regional and sectoral bodies. So in terms of implications for Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific, it really depends on who's doing what in that region, and also how states in that region use the BBNJ mechanisms and the BBNJ bodies to do things like propose and designate marine protected areas. One point that I would flag, this is just sort of my initial contribution to this discussion, is the provisions on disputed areas. Especially during the second week of negotiations, it felt like there was so much conversation about the South China Sea without ever using the term South China Sea. After the first week of this last session, China proposed a bunch of new draft text about disputed areas that they were sort of proposing to pepper throughout the treaty. And what we ended up was with a more moderated version of those proposals that looks something like this. So the next 3 slides are 3 parts of the BBNJ treaty that concern disputed areas. And so essentially, it's not very surprising. The basic idea is that the BBNJ agreement can't affect any claims to sovereignty, sovereign rights, or jurisdiction. That even if you're proposing a protected area in a part of the South China Sea, for example, or you're conducting an environmental impact assessment, or you have scientific actors under your jurisdiction that are bioprospecting and accessing marine genetic resources, that none of that has any relevance for the settlement of disputes over sovereignty or jurisdiction. And so this Article 4 bis, which just means it comes after Article 4, they haven't finalized the numbers yet. This is a part of the treaty that is kind of an overview. It covers everything to come. But you do see more specific rules in, for example, the area-based management tools section. And I underline this part about the conference of parties because this is a bit ambiguous, I think. It may be interpreted such that the conference of parties cannot consider any NPA proposals that occur in or that would be placed in disputed areas, which could be a real problem for Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific if you can't use this primary tool for conservation and protection of marine ecosystems in any area where there's a dispute. And so this is an example of moderated language that was a compromise proposal, perhaps because states could see what they wanted to see in this text. And then this last area, which is on the settlement of disputes, I believe is Article 55. It's just, I think this was to satisfy states that were particularly concerned about whether disputed areas would be involved, especially because of this phrase, for the avoidance of doubt. Once again, none of this will be a basis for asserting or denying rights over sovereignty or jurisdiction kind of claims. And this is my last slide here, but I just want to reference this image on the left. I should have put the citation to this article on ocean development and international law that I got this image from. But this is just to point out that there are unresolved extended continental shelf claims. And this includes existing claims and also prospective claims by the Philippines that would be an unsettled claim, but also there's parts in the BBNJ agreement that say that if you're dealing with the high seas that are super adjacent or above an extended continental shelf claim, that those activities or those kind of mechanisms for conservation and sustainable use must have due regard for the sovereign rights of the coastal state that has jurisdiction over an extended continental shelf. Due regard is very common in UNCLOS and associated institutions. And it's basically like, both sets of interests have to be considered, but there's not necessarily a hierarchy between them. So that's one area where kind of disagreements about how the BBNJ is applied might come up in this region when you're talking about an activity or an issue that affects both the water column that is beyond national jurisdiction and the continental shelf, which is within national jurisdiction. So I went a couple minutes over. I'm sorry, Rocky. I'm sorry to the organizers. But this is me. I'm excited for the Q&A. But if you have other comments or questions afterwards, feel free to send me an email check out my website to see what other sort of work I do, and looking forward to chatting.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Beth, for that fantastic presentation. That was such a clear overview of the final text, not the draft text of the BBNJ agreement. And thank you for letting us know like what the insights were being there, knowing all the details and the proceedings and the negotiations. And also the reminder that it's very exciting. This is the first new implementing agreement since the 1990s. So it's really huge, especially for ocean governance. But you touch across a lot of topics, but like area-based management tools, EIAs, institutions that have yet to be developed, and particularly issues on disputed areas. And I'm really curious on how these matters will develop further on and play out further for the adoption of this treaty and in the future. Thank you very much, Beth, again. And after those insights from New York, we now go closer to home to our next panelist. Our next panelist is Andreas Aditya Salim. Andreas is a lawyer specialized in the law of the sea and is the senior advisor at the Indonesia Ocean Justice Initiative, a think tank that he co-founded in early 2020 after serving as legal counsel in the Indonesian Presidential Task Force to combat illegal fishing. Andreas obtained his law degree from the University of Indonesia and LLM from the University of California, Berkeley. He's also an alumnus of Rose Academy of Oceans Law and Policy, as well as the UN Dolos Nippon Foundation Fellowship Program. Andreas, thank you very much. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Rocky, and thank you. Amazing presentation from Beth. Maybe I have the first two short comments. I share the same frustration with Beth when I observed the Twitter being flooded with hashtag High Seas Treaty. It's certainly not. It's BBNJ Treaty. And the second thing, maybe, thank you, Beth. You have taken half of my presentation because I have I have prepared presentation about the South China Sea as well. So I hope you all can see my slide.
Yep.
Okay, good. So I'm not gonna talk too heavy on the legal side, but I wanted to share to all the participants the situation of the Southeast Asia. And I think I might suggest something in the end on how the countries in the Southeast Asia quote unquote receiving or preparing to enter into force of the BBNJ agreement. First, this is a little bit background of the Southeast Asia region. 10 countries in the region, mostly developing, according to the UN, only 2 out of 10 countries in the region considered as upper middle income, which is high income, which is Brunei, Darussalam, and Singapore. The other is upper middle or lower middle. The 10 countries are mostly, they are not really active in the activity within the area beyond national jurisdiction, except for fishing, and it's only for several RFMOs. I'm going to show you later in the later slides about the point number 2. And then in this region, if we talk about BBNJ, of course, we are looking to 3 specific areas: Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and the South China Sea. I'm gonna go a little bit detailed to explain point number 2. So if we take example, for example, CCSBT RFMO. So I'm talking about the high seas fishing. In this CCSBT, you know, it's only Philippines and Indonesia, and the catch, even the Indonesia ranked the 5th producers. The first one is Australia, and then Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and in terms of numbers of production, Indonesia is the 5th. Philippines is, I don't know, the latest data from CCSBT is 0. And then let's take another example from IOTC. For example, there are 4 countries from the Southeast Asia region. And in terms of production, for example, Malaysia is kind of low, Thailand as well, only Indonesia. It's quite high in production of high seas fishing. And another example is, for example, from the WCPFC. Only 4 Southeast Asian countries participating in the WCPFC, but here on the right side of the slide, You can see only Indonesia that has a quite high number of production high seas fishing. But the other countries in the Southeast Asia region, they are not really active in the high seas fishing, or maybe in the other FMO. The other example is IATTC. See, here is only one country from Indonesia, from the Southeast Asia region participating in the IATTC, which is Indonesia, but no fishing vessels flagged to Indonesia catching fish in this IATTC area of competence. Now, let's turn to the other activities existing in the area beyond national jurisdiction, which is deep seabed mining. Again, the phenomena, I think, is the same. Here we can see that the entity exploring the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone, no entity from the Southeast Asia region. Mostly from the Pacific, joint venture with the developed country or the developed country itself, like Japan, China, Russia, France, Korea, but no from the Southeast Asia country. Let's jump into the other area of deep seabed mining exploration, for example, Indian Ocean. Again, you can see down here, there is no entity from the Southeast Asia region. It's the same with the Pacific Ocean. And it's also the same for the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Also the same with the South Atlantic Ocean. So generally, we could say that Southeast Asia countries are not active players in the ABNJ. In terms of BBNJ, of course, we hope that this will not be the case, because the marine genetic resources, they have a very, very, very high value in terms of for health matters, for financial, for biological matters. Of course, it's very valuable. But yeah, that's the existing situation. But at least, do they at least participate in capacity building? Let's see to the data published by the ISA. Yes, the Southeast Asia region is quite active in the capacity building activities provided by the ISA. At least we can see here there are 5 capacity building programs by the ISA, and at least the number from the Asia Pacific group is quite high. But the question next is, where are they now? Are they keep working on this sector exploration of the deep seabed, and then do they still working helping the government in formulating policy relevant to the high seas activity, deep seabed mining activity, or BBNJ activity? We don't know yet. And like what Beth has explained to you before, it's clear from the final text of the BBNJ that the area of application of the BBNJ is area beyond national jurisdiction, which is high seas in the area. And then, of course, this is the challenge for us, because we know that there's quite a tension in the South China Sea, the deployment of various patrolling assets by the China government, for example, and then the building of artificial islands. And there's I have a little debate with my colleague in the office about, well, oh, are you sure this is a high seas? This is semi-enclosed area, blah, blah, blah. Article 4 of the BBNJ, as Elizabeth already explained to you before. So I see that this is going to be a very challenging for the Southeast Asia countries, because with the tension happening right now in the South China Sea, it appears that it's not only about a claim of maritime entitlement. It goes now further to certain types of control and exercise of power by a country to some part of activities that can be conducted, should be freely conducted by other states. So it's really worrying that if the BBNJ agreement will enter into force, it's a bit unclear for me on how to predict what will be the future of BBNJ agreement in the South China Sea region. The most important message that I want to share with all the participants is that Southeast Asia countries should be more proactive once the BBNJ agreement enters into force, because this agreement really provides Southeast Asia countries with opportunities from the capacity building and transfer of marine technology as laid out under Annex 2 of the BBNJ agreement. I only put here one page of the annex because the annex itself is, Annex 2 itself is like 3 pages. So the Southeast Asia countries should be proactive to benefit from this capacity building and transfer of marine technology. At the very least from now, we know that the BBNJ agreement is not yet in force, but at least until now, Southeast Asia countries can start to prepare themselves. Little actions, but maybe meaningful. Gather the key scientists that already exist in your country. Establish scientist to scientist or academic to academic or ministry to ministry engagement from now with the developed countries capable of performing deep sea activities. Establish centers for BBNJ in-depth studies. Build capacity for producing equipment and technologies for BBNJ. Because I think for the Southeast Asia region, number 4 is going to be the most challenging issues because it's expensive. It's a very advanced technology. So maybe from now, it's a very good window of time for the government in the Southeast Asia to really engage with the developed countries. And then, of course, allocate appropriate funding to support all the preparation activities. And maybe this is my final slide. The question for us all is what will be the future of BBNJ implementation in the South China Sea? You know, because of we all know that implementing or performing deep sea activities is very costly, and the nearest high seas pocket, the nearest the area pocket to the Southeast Asia countries is the South China Sea. But we know what the situation of the South China Sea now. So it's really a big question for us, the international community, to address this issue. That's it, Rocky. Going back to you.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for that excellent presentation and contextualizing the issues and challenges in Southeast Asia. RFMOs and fisheries, and it takes me back to that's insights also that it can't undermine existing mechanisms, but also on specific issues such as deep seabed mining and capacity building. I really appreciate that you flagged the challenges at the outset, as the disputed areas, and I think that's a conversation that we'll continue to have even beyond the entry into force of the BBNJ agreement. But despite all these challenges, there are opportunities. And Southeast Asia should be more proactive in terms of capacity building opportunities and technology transfer that are all laid down in the agreement. So thank you for flagging all these things, Andreas. Really appreciate that. And now we go to our last panelist. Also from Southeast Asia, we have Pradeep Singh. Pradeep is a fellow at the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam, Germany. He's also the deputy chair of the Ocean Law Specialist Group of the World Commission on Environmental Law, or WCEL, and the lead of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management's thematic group on deep seabed mining. Apart from that, Pradeep advises several state delegations to the International Seabed Authority and is regularly invited to provide legal expertise on deep seabed mining. Pradeep hails from Penang in Malaysia, where he trained as a lawyer and previously worked as a judicial officer. He's joining us today from Kingston, Jamaica. where he's currently attending the ongoing negotiations at the International Seabed Authority. Thank you very much, Pradeep. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you much. Thank you for joining, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Rocky, and good day, good morning, good evening to everyone. It's 5:45 in the morning here, but I'll try to be as coherent as I can. First, let me show my slides. Yes, and I hope you're able to see the screen.
Yes.
So yes, today I'll be talking about deep seabed mining in the area and its relationship with the final text of the BBNJ agreement, as the previous speakers has sort of already alluded to. So just very quickly, I will of course provide a short introduction to what deep seabed mining or DSM is and what's going on in the area, specifically referring to the International Seabed Authority, where negotiations are currently ongoing to develop regulations for exploitation. And then I'll sort of draw links between the work of the ISA to the final text of the BBNJ agreement and some very quick conclusions. What is seabed mining? Essentially, we're talking about the exploration and future exploitation of mineral deposits at depths greater than 200 meters of the ocean. So these minerals can be found in areas within national jurisdiction, as well as seabed areas beyond national jurisdiction. And when we say seabed areas beyond national jurisdiction, the legal term for that is the area, as the previous speakers have sort of mentioned. The area and its mineral resources are the common heritage of humankind. We know this from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but also from previous UN General Assembly resolutions that sort of designated the mineral resources of the area as the common heritage of humankind. This means that the mineral resources belong to humankind as a whole. They can be accessed only through the International Seabed Authority, and benefits derived from exploration and especially exploitation activities are to be shared through an equitable mechanism for benefit sharing. So the previous speakers have sort of alluded to the maritime zones under the Convention of the Law of the Sea. And here, essentially, we're talking about ABNJ, areas beyond national jurisdiction. So that includes the high seas, which basically is beyond the exclusive economic zones of coastal states, as well as the area, which I think, as the first speaker sort of explained, is not in exactly the high seas. So the area is smaller than the high seas because of the extended continental shelf regime that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea allows for coastal states if conditions are justified to extend their continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. And so, as the first speaker also sort of identified, the area is indeed smaller than the high seas. So if we're looking at the spaces that are in white here, that's the area. But if you really consider the high seas, that would be after we deduct these areas that are in red, which are basically the existing claims for the extended continental shelf regime. And I think why this is important, especially in the context of BBNJ, is because when we talk about the areas in red, so the extended continental shelf, if accepted and extended, these coastal states actually enjoy sovereign rights to exploit the seabed. And this is very interesting because the water column above the extended continental shelf is the high seas. And so exploitation activities of the extended continental shelf regime would, of course, directly have an impact on the water column above it, which falls under the remit of the BBNJ agreement. So that, I think, is a very interesting point to bear in mind. The convention was adopted in 1982, entered into force in 1994, known as the Constitution for the Ocean due to its comprehensiveness. And there is a dedicated part for the area, which is in Part 11. I won't speak about Part 7, which talks about the high seas, but focusing on the area and the deep seabed mining regime. And the fundamental principles that we see under part 11 of UNCLOS is, as I've mentioned, the mineral resources are the common heritage of mankind. Basically, no state or no actors can actually claim or exercise sovereignty or sovereign rights here because these resources are vested in humankind as a whole, on whose behalf the International Seabed Authority shall act. And whatever benefits that are received shall be distributed through an equitable benefit sharing mechanism. The area shall be used for exclusively for peaceful purposes, and the ISA is required to take necessary measures to ensure the effective protection of the marine environment from the harmful effects of mining activities in the area. And this actually extends to the water column above it, as well as towards the coastline as well, the environmental harm. And that's the responsibility of the ISA to ensure that such harm from seabed mining activities are managed. Very quickly, also just to give you an indication of the type of resources that we're talking about, these polymetallic nodules, potato-shaped nodules, which are found in abyssal plains at depths between 4,000 to 6,000 meters, mainly for nickel, copper, cobalt, and manganese. You have polymetallic sulfides, which are located at hydrothermal vents at an average depth of 1,400 to 3,700 meters, also known to have a large abundance of metal content of copper, lead, zinc, as well as gold and silver. And then you have cobalt-rich ferromanganese crust located in seamounts at depths between 800 to 2,400 meters, mainly cobalt, but also other metal contents, including rare earth elements. Just wanted to also sort of quickly show, for the benefit of all audience, where such resources are located. As I've mentioned, these are located in areas within national jurisdiction as well as areas beyond national jurisdiction. In the case of polymetallic nodules, over 70 to 80% are located in areas beyond national jurisdiction, so the international seabed area. But you also have substantial amount of resources in areas within national jurisdiction, nodules, for example, within the exclusive economic zone, continental shelf, of the Cook Islands, as well as, a lot of cobalt-rich crust and polymetallic sulfides that also fall in areas within national jurisdiction. But the International Seabed Authority, of course, only exercises a mandate over the area. Very quickly about environmental impacts on deep seabed mining. We know that these minerals take a long time to form. Recent science also tells us that organisms are actually dependent on the minerals, so they actually live on the nodules themselves. We now know that vents and seamounts are full of life. So when we were negotiating the convention in the 1960s, 1970s, we knew very little about the deep ocean, but now science is sort of telling us that, it wasn't, or it's not a desert as sort of previously thought. Of course, the deep ocean is not used to direct human disturbances. Current extractive methods are thought to be highly destructive, as well as indications that restoration is not possible on human timescales. We know very little about the potential impact of noise, light, vibration on marine life, as well as marine mammals. The impacts will be three-dimensional, and plumes are thought to be able to spread quite a distance and could affect coastal states quite significantly. And we have not really quantified the benefits of having the deep ocean for its natural capital purposes. For example, we now know the very critical role that the deep ocean plays with respect to climate regulation and carbon storage, providing key services, as well as future medicinal and pharmaceutical needs. And the current baseline data that we have on the deep ocean is still very, very poor. So just very quickly on why we should be concerned about what happens in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Ecological connectivity, that's now being more and more scientific evidence is revealing that whatever happens in ABNJ comes back to affect coastal communities. In the first two diagrams here, it's not about deep seabed mining. I just wanted to point that out, but it sort of shows the ecological connectivity between areas beyond national jurisdiction and coastal communities. And there's a very big, if you look at the second diagram, a very big impact or potential, connectivity, very close connectivity with the coastlines of developing countries. So what happens in ABNJ particularly could affect developing countries, and also to sort of bear in mind that the evidence is now building up on how deep seabed mining could disrupt the seafloor food web and affect fisheries, which in turn would affect coastal communities. So what is the International Seabed Authority? It's an autonomous body established under the convention with mandate over resources to act on behalf of humankind as a whole. And this body is responsible for developing regulations for exploration and exploitation. As a regulator, it also considers and decides whether or not to award mining contracts, collects payment from the contracts that it awards, as I mentioned, to facilitate equitable benefit sharing. And very interestingly also, it's required to actually compensate land-based mining developing countries for the adverse economic impacts that seabed mining would have on their terrestrial mining activities. And this is quite relevant for us in Southeast Asia, especially from Indonesia as well, which is a big terrestrial mining country. And doing so whilst at the same time ensuring the effective protection of the marine environment from the harmful effects of mining and to promote marine scientific research. What's happening now at the ISA? Turned 25 just a few years ago. Exploration activities have been going on for 2 decades. Nodules since the year 2000, sulfides since 2010, and for crust since 2012. A total of 31 contracts have been awarded, 19 for nodules, 7 for sulfides, and 5 for crust. This needs to be updated because Brazil is now in the process of revoking its contract with the ISA because it has actually extended its continental shelf. And so it's the area that was previously under its contract that was under the area. It's a good example of an instance where it's now basically within national jurisdiction. Location of current contracts, we have on the very left, the Clarion-Clipperton zone, where there's the most number of contracts for nodules. Just to perhaps correct the previous speaker, Singapore actually holds a contract. So there is representation from Southeast Asia that actually holds a contract with the ISA. So my neighboring country, Singapore. There are also contracts in the Mid-Atlantic Ocean, as well as in the Southern Indian Ocean. There are also contracts for polymetallic sulfides, and then closer to our friends from the Philippines in the Western Pacific Oceans, there's quite a lot of quite a substantial number of contracts there for cobalt-rich crust at seamount areas. Now, the move towards exploitation, as some of you may be aware, at the International Seabed Authority, negotiations are now going towards developing regulations for exploitation, and this has been accelerated due to the invocation of a treaty provision by the Republic of Nauru, which essentially puts a deadline on the International Seabed Authority to complete the regulations. That deadline is coming very soon in July. At the same time, calls for a pause or moratorium are growing, and France indeed has gone even slightly further to call for a ban on deep seabed mining. So it's quite interesting times at the International Seabed Authority. So as I've mentioned, or as Rocky has mentioned in the beginning, I'm currently in Jamaica, where the International Seabed Authority is based for the ongoing meeting of the council, which would end this Friday, and I'm looking forward to leaving Jamaica. But negotiations of the draft text for the exploitation regulations has been progressing through working groups. We have one on the marine environment, we have one on ICE, inspection, compliance, and enforcement. We have one on institutional matters. We have one on financial terms, and we are currently now working with the other regulations that do not fit in the above working group through the precedence text. The next meeting for the council in this year is in July, the 10th to the 21st of July, and then later in the year, 30th October to 8th November. But what's interesting is that I've mentioned that deadline due to the invocation of a treaty provision by Nauru. And so there is a deadline for the adoption of the exploitation regulations by 9th of July, 2023. And I've put deadline in inverted commas because I would argue, and a lot of states have now argued, that it's not a hard deadline and it's one that the ISA can miss. The consequences, though, is there that if the regulations remain incomplete and an application is submitted, the council would still have to consider an application, and such application can be approved notwithstanding the fact that the regulations are not there. So the general rule is that there cannot be any exploitation activities without the regulations, but this deadline and invocation of the treaty provision requires the ISA to consider an application despite the fact that the regulations are not there yet. I'm going to come to the end of the presentation very soon, but I just wanted to make some very quick links to the BBNJ text. I think Article 4 has been mentioned by the previous speaker, and subparagraph 2 is, I guess, very relevant, that the BBNJ agreement shall be interpreted and applied in a manner that does not undermine existing instruments and frameworks, including sectoral ones. And this is a clear reference to the International Seabed Authority, among others. But there's also Article 6, which sort of ensures or requires cooperation and ensuring coherence through other legal instruments and frameworks, as well as sectoral bodies. And I think subparagraph 2 is quite interesting because it requires state parties, when it's adopted and ratified and in force, requires parties to promote the objectives of the BBNJ agreement when they are participating in decision-making under other relevant sectoral bodies. And I think this is very interesting because, as I'll come to shortly, states have in the last weeks cross-referenced the BBNJ final text with respect to the work of the International Seabed Authority and the negotiations on the exploitation regulations for mining. Key components that overlap: marine genetic resources. You have the access and benefit sharing under BBNJ, and on the other hand, you have the responsibility of ISA contractors. It's very clear that the ISA does not have any mandate over marine genetic resources, but there's a gray area between the samples that contractors collect at the moment and in future about exploitation and what is the status of such marine genetic resources, which still need to be clarified. On EIAs, you have the requirements under BBNJ, but the ISA has its own regime for environmental impact assessments, which arguably would prevail. But one thing to note is that currently, since we're talking about exploration, the EIA regime at the ISA is relatively weak. It actually comes in the forms of recommendations, leaving a lot of discretion to contractors, as opposed to being in the form of binding regulations. So that is something that some of us, including myself, has argued that the EIA regime for exploration activities need to be revisited. We are currently discussing, as I've mentioned, the exploitation regulations, and the EIA regime for exploitation is strengthened, but of course it's still in a draft form that we can't really tell which direction it would go, since quite a lot of important provisions are still in square brackets and remain up for negotiation. On ABMTs, including protected areas, I think, again, there's a lot of overlap between what could be done in future under BBNJ and ABMT measures adopted by the ISA. And there could be potential overlap between measures that are, to be taken under BBNJ with ISA mining areas, as well as I've mentioned, perhaps those that are undertaken on the extended continental shelf. Finally, I think clearinghouse mechanisms under BBNJ, so basically the platform for sharing of information under BBNJ, as opposed to the sharing of information under the ISA. That's also something that has a lot of overlap, including confidentiality of contractor data provided under the ISA. So these are some areas that need to be resolved. Last two slides, I think, need to also take into account other relevant developments that have an implication on activities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And there is, of course, thinking that the BBNJ is to be used as a platform to achieve the SDGs, as well as the 30 by 30 target under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adopted by the CBD COP in December last year, and how this applies in the context of ABNJ. And interestingly, during the same meeting, the CBD COP also adopted a decision that seems to also be speaking to the International Seabed Authority, whereby it encourages state parties to the CBD and other governments to ensure before seabed mining takes place that the impacts of the marine environment and biodiversity are sufficiently researched, the risks are understood, technologies and operational practices do not cause harmful effect to the marine environment, and appropriate rules, regulations, and procedures are put in place by the ISA. And so I think, there is an argument to be made that, progress made in other instruments and processes also have an implication on the work of the International Seabed Authority. So to conclude, we know that the ocean is facing unprecedented levels of threat at the moment, and DSM is being considered in the midst of an urgent need to protect the environment, to reduce and eliminate the loss of marine biodiversity, improve ocean health, and to reverse ocean degradation. DSM seabed mining activities in the area can potentially conflict and can, undermine perhaps ambitions under the BBNJ agreement. And I think here it's important to sort of, strike a balance between not undermine the BBNJ agreement, not undermining other instruments, as opposed to the requirement to ensure cooperation and coherence across the board. And so I agree with the previous speakers that, the adoption of the text and the first few years of the BBNJ agreement, so when the COP of the meeting of the parties, of the BBNJ agreements takes place, the initial advancements there would be very critical to determine coherence in ABNJ. We also need more awareness, and we also need more state participations at the International Seabed Authority. And I think here there's an opportunity for Southeast Asian countries to get more involved, to come to the ISA, to voice their opinions or concerns, and try to influence the decision-making processes there. I want to conclude with 2 points. The first is that, as I mentioned earlier, that the ISA member states in this meeting have particularly welcomed and acknowledged the importance of the final text of the BBNJ agreement. And there were actually numerous ambitious proposals that were made last week that states have sort of proposed to sort of reflect certain ambitions under the BBNJ to feature in the mining code. And I think this is another way to spin it off and sort of say that, instead of talking about BBNJ not undermining other sectoral bodies, including the International Seabed Authority, there's a way to sort of ensure coherence between the two processes. Question now remains how this should be reflected in the ISA mining code. Another sort of reflection that I would like to leave you with is there a new or a more progressive role for SPLOS, which is the meeting of the state parties to the Law of the Sea Convention. With this new implementing agreement, a new one since the mid-1990s, would the state parties of the Law of the Sea Convention sort of, consider, all matters on the law of the sea more proactively? And what about the role of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in the future? Could we in the future be seeing a request for an advisory opinion to see what is the role and how do we ensure coherence between what is, ambitions under and measures under the BBNJ agreement with respect to other sectoral bodies that operate in ABNJ? And I think this is something that could happen in the next 5 years or so. So with that, I want to say thank you. Apologies for going a little over time, but happy to take questions, and also please feel free to contact me if you wish. Here are some pictures of me at the International Seabed Authority. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, as always, Pradeep, for that very comprehensive and very insightful presentation, and sharing to us like all the things that are happening all the way from Kingston, Jamaica, at the headquarters of the International Seabed Authority. There are a lot of current developments in the ISA, in the meetings now with the development of the DSM, the deep seabed mining regulations. So a lot of things that we are waiting for and what's happening there. But you also shed light on a few issues that are very important, like integral parts of the BBNJ regime, like the mineral resources in the area, which are the common heritage of humankind, as they say, and as written in the Law of the Sea Convention, and its attendant environmental issues and impacts. Now, should this be occasion for concern? There are many issues that are being raised on these issues, and I'm curious to know what's next with what we know now on issues such as deep seabed mining and access and benefit sharing, EIA, environmental impact assessments, and all these regimes that are relevant for both ISA and BBNJ. So we can discuss more on the next 30 minutes in this Q&A session, but also we'll be looking forward to more conversations on that in the next few years. So this point, I'd like to thank all the panelists for their fantastic presentations, Beth, Pradeep, and also Andreas, who unfortunately has to go for another appointment. But please, if you have any further questions, you can type them down in the question and answer box below in your screens. We have a number of questions already, quite exciting questions, and we look forward to the thoughts of our panelists. Some of the questions I will just lump together. We can start with this series of questions, I would say, that relate to the interaction and the interplay of the BBNJ agreement to other international agreements and other instruments. Some of these have been identified here, such as the Fish Stocks Agreement, which is also an agreement under the Law of the Sea Convention, but also the CITES, or the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, as well as the Nagoya Protocol on accessing benefit sharing on genetic resources. So all of these have been developed years prior to the BBNJ agreement. They have they interact in some way. If both of our panelists could speak as to the interplay and the interaction of this BBNJ agreement to all these other existing mechanisms that we have. I'd like to go first. Beth?
Well, I had the advantage of looking at the questions while Pradeep was talking, so I have some thoughts already. So the question about the interplay between BBNJ and other agreements. So some particular agreements were flagged. The first being the Fish Stocks Agreement. So in a way, they're very related, but in another way, they're not at all related. So the Fish Stocks Agreement is the second implementing agreement to UNCLOS, with the BBNJ being the third implementing agreement, and the first one is the Part 11 agreement on seabed mining. And in the early BBNJ sessions, there was a question that wasn't a lot of certainty on about what kind of implementing agreement the BBNJ would be, because the Part 11 agreement fuses with UNCLOS, such that if you ratify one, you have to ratify the other. Whereas the Fish Stocks Agreement is a freestanding treaty that the United States, for example, can ratify without participating in UNCLOS. The BBNJ has ended up also being a freestanding treaty, so that non-members of UNCLOS can participate in it. And in that way, it's like the Fish Stocks Agreement. It's also like the Fish Stocks Agreement and has to be fully consistent with UNCLOS and interpreted in light of that consistency with UNCLOS. But it's very unrelated in the sense that the Fish Stocks Agreement deals with fisheries management, and in particular, regional fisheries management organizations, RFMOs. It sort of fleshes out the duties and obligations associated with RFMO management. And RFMOs are part of the regional and sectoral organizations that the BBNJ agreement cannot undermine. And so there's definitely not a hierarchical relationship between the BBNJ and the Fish Stocks Agreement. They're more like parallel. In terms of CITES, I think the answer is there's no formal relationship between these two. I mean, certainly activities under each could serve the same goals. Perhaps capacity building through the BBNJ could support implementation of CITES provisions, but no formal relationship, and certainly no formalized relationship in the treaty. The Nagoya Protocol, so this deals with access and benefit sharing around genetic resources within national jurisdiction, no formal relationship. So the Nagoya Protocol extends, it's on land territory, and it extends out into the territorial sea. So it does not extend into areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the Nagoya Protocol was talked about a lot, especially in early BBNJ sessions, as a potential model, but it wasn't considered, or it wasn't embraced as a fully applicable model, because the Nagoya Protocol deals with national jurisdiction, and areas beyond national jurisdiction are fundamentally different in terms of who is it that has to benefit and who is regulating access. I just want to say, before I cede the floor back to Pradeep, that when it comes to environmental impact assessments and marine protected areas, or area-based management tools, there's really, in the treaty, there's three types of ways that the BBNJ relates to other mechanisms. The first is that members of the BBNJ agreement, once they ratify, they are obligated to work within the other bodies that they are members of to achieve the goals of the BBNJ agreement or to pursue those goals of conservation and sustainable use. It's not more specific than that, though. They just have to work to achieve the same goals. The second mechanism is the Conference of Parties is supposed to establish mechanisms to consult and coordinate with other bodies. So that's yet to come, but there's supposed to be an institution to institution kind of consultation relationship. And the third is that there's places in the BBNJ agreement where processes outside of the BBNJ are recognized through the BBNJ agreement. So for example, and this goes to many of the other questions about impact assessments and especially about seabed mining, if there is an EIA that is equivalent to the BBNJ process that's done for an activity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, that's like good enough. You don't have to do the BBNJ process. But this was a remaining controversy that really got watered down or made more general over time. There were options like it has to be substantively or functionally equivalent, or it has to be comparably comprehensive. So creating a specific standard of if you do it outside, it has to be good enough. But they couldn't reach agreement, so they just went with equivalent, which is very much in the eye of the beholder, whether or not, for example, the EIA processes under the Seabed Authority, which Pradeep described as relatively weak, whether those would be considered equivalent to the BBNJ standards is an open question.
Thank you, Beth. Pradeep, you might have something to add.
Yeah, no, I think I can be very quick because Beth was very comprehensive. So yeah, no, I see the BBNJ as sort of connecting the dots and drawing links between all the other sectoral bodies and other processes that are, taking place in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And this sort of requirement for, individually outside of the BBNJ process, for all these other processes to bear in mind the ambitions under BBNJ as well as the objectives under BBNJ, and to sort of bring that into the decision-making processes in their respective fora. And I think as I sort of give the example that states have started to already do that, even though the text is not adopted yet, but they've already started to make references to the BBNJ agreement, or some states are, proposing very ambitious proposals that sort of say that, we need to meet this, we need to meet the 30 by 30 target before we allow mining activities to commence, and so on. And they're trying to fit that into the mining code. Again, also with EIA, with respect to EIAs, there have been sort of discussions about what we do at the ISA cannot be lower than what is required under BBNJ. We need to go further. And they're trying to sort of already strengthen that sort of a relationship or interconnection with BBNJ to sort of ensure that it's not just equivalent, but it's more ambitious than what is sort of required under BBNJ. And so I think that really gives effect, especially to Article 6, which requires states to sort of take that ambition that they've agreed on BBNJ to other processes that they are involved in. Of course, again, as with BBNJ, there are going to be compromises in this other fora as well. But indeed, for example, in the case of ABMTs that are being considered at the ISA and ABMTs under BBNJ, we would indeed need to have, more interaction if indeed, BBNJ identifies a certain area requiring protection, whereas the ISA is sort of interested in awarding mining contracts in that area. And so that needs to be considered. And let's also not forget what happens under the extended continental shelf, which is an area within sovereign rights of coastal states, and how activities or seabed mining or seabed exploitation activities in such areas could also sort of interact and undermine conservation efforts under BBNJ. Thanks.
Thanks, Pradeep. So that's good to know that there are a lot of coordination and making sure that it's fitting in with other targets that already exist there, But both of you mentioned EIA a couple of times. I think it's very important, and it's also a number of times been asked in the questions, especially with the data that we have now, with what we know, and also the issue of applying the precautionary approach, precautionary principle in managing or exploiting possibly resources in the deep sea bed in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So maybe I'd like to get your thoughts on that, on the precautionary approach, on what EIA might look like in the future as it develops further on. But before I give the floor to you, I'd like also the director of Ariel, Matthew Baird, please join us here. He has a lot of things to say also about EIA, and I'd like to have a good conversation on this very important and exciting topic of BBMJ. So
thank you. Thank you very much, Rocky, and thanks, Beth and Pradeep. And Beth, in particular, thank you also for your articles in Marine Policy, because especially I think there was one recently last year on this year on liability issues, and so my interest is in environmental impact assessment and obviously terrestrial EIA, and one of the foundation principles of Ariel was in fact Rocky and I talking about how on coastal zones, oceans and marine issues, we apply terrestrial approaches that may not be fit for purpose. And I know that EIA, we've had arguments under the Law of the Sea Convention about how EIA should be done. And I think also, the issue about seabed mining, deep sea mining, or any activities. I note that the Environmental Law Institute in the US has convened working groups looking at recommendations for environmental impact assessment. And picking up, I think, also some of the questions, some of the issues I think we're really interested is EIA on a terrestrial basis has significant challenges. Baseline assessments are often poorly done. Independence of contractors and EIA consultants are always challenged. The role of an approval authority that might also be a regulator, the idea of the benefit sharing often doesn't go back to local communities or those impacted, and certainly issues of compensation, liability. We now look in terms of terrestrial mining, we look at bonds, we look at other financial guarantees, but we also acknowledge that most of the mines that are open are actually liability because they won't be able to be closed. The environmental harm that is created by terrestrial mining is ongoing and may last significant periods of time. So one of the challenges, it seems to me, is the need to ensure that environmental impact assessment or broader strategic environmental assessment or marine spatial planning takes into account more the challenges of doing baseline assessment. And Pradeep, you mentioned, we're finding that these are not deserts, these are actually oases of extraordinary creatures. The issue of how this impacts on climate change, we just don't know. And I know there's been a call for a moratorium. It mirrors some of the calls for moratoriums on damming of mainstream rivers in the Mekong and the Salween and the Ayeyarwady in Southeast Asia. So we've seen these calls. And it also seems to me that the current regimes that are being discussed don't include those core principles that may be international environmental law principles, the precautionary principle, polluter pays, and more importantly, the role of the decision maker. If it's going to be the seabed authority, they obviously benefit from approving, they don't benefit from rejecting. Is there going to be some independent authority that can look? And the other issue is the challenges, and environmental impact assessment probably has been strengthened considerably by citizens and communities being able to approach courts for reviewing of decisions and improving conditions of approval, including things like financial bonds to ensure that if something goes wrong, there is at least some money to fix it. One worries, though, that in the context of deep seabed mining, if something goes wrong, we're never going to be able to compensate for what happens because we actually don't know those issues. So I just wanted to sort of raise that, and we had a couple of questions as well, looking at the role of environmental impact assessment. But it seemed also that idea of one of the challenges we face is trying to fit terrestrial management regimes and environmental impact assessments to an environment where it just can't work because of those key issues just can't be replicated in an oceans environment. So Appreciate your comments, and thanks, Rocky, for that opportunity to have a short intervention.
Thank you very much, Matthew. A lot of issues back in EIA, both in the terrestrial context and also in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So I'm keen to get your thoughts. There were a lot of issues that were brought in the question box, like compliance, the EIA, who will monitor supervision of the implementation of EIA, and also like risk and management, like all these issues. And again, with the other environmental law principles, such as the precautionary approach in place, like what would it look like within the context of the areas beyond national jurisdiction? So anyone would like to take first stab?
I can go first this time around. I think, thanks, Matt, for the basically the comments and the questions. You basically covered everything in your intervention, which I fully agree. And indeed, there are a lot of weaknesses in the current regime at the International Seabed Authority, at least in terms of environmental impact assessments. For the environmental, for the exploration phase, as I mentioned in my presentation, the regime is very weak. It's largely governed by recommendations instead of being in binding regulations. The environmental impact processes and procedures, there's no real explicit power that gives the authority or the regulator the power to reject an EIS. It's essentially more for informational purposes, and there is the opportunity for the authority to suggest improvements or other measures that need to be taken, but they do not really have the power to reject an EIS and prohibit the contractor from going ahead with its exploratory work, and in this case relates more to test mining activities, so the testing of equipment, which can be quite damaging and large scale as well, and hence an EIS is required beforehand through the regulations, but enforced through the recommendations, which are, as I said, non-binding. Now, when we are discussing the exploitation regulations, and negotiations have been trying to strengthen this EIA process, and there have been some delegations who sort of said that this is very important and we need to give the ISA the power to reject an EIS, as well as to sort of require independent scientific review of the EIS, as opposed to previously under exploration where this is not required. And so they're trying to elaborate the process for EIA, EIS when it comes to exploitation activities, and try to give more power to the ISA as a regulator to intervene at the EIS stage. But again, there are quite a number, or a sizable number, of states that do not agree to this approach. And I think, Matthew, as you sort of mentioned, they see the ISA as a body to facilitate the activities. There's no real intention to prevent activities to happen. It's just basically to create a level playing field. That's where the ISA sort of sees itself as a regulator, and not really to be a proactive or ambitious regulator that really takes the environment into the forefront of things. So I think the dynamics are very interesting. We will see in the coming months in which direction we go with the negotiations and the mining code that comes up for adoption whenever it comes up, but it doesn't seem to be ready very soon.
For those points, and also forward to the developments in the next few months, I guess. No, and Beth, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. First, on precautionary approach and principle, they actually couldn't decide which one was better or more correct, so they ended up with precautionary principle or precautionary approach as appropriate. Disagreements both about what each meant and which one was more appropriate for the treaty. Some of the questions in the chat were about what about an activity that happens within national jurisdiction but has impacts beyond, or the opposite. And those were some controversial items in the treaty, but here's how it ended up. So if you have an activity within national jurisdiction that may have substantial pollution or significant adverse harm to the marine environment beyond national jurisdiction, you have to do an EIA, but it could be the BB&J process or your national process. So for an activity within national areas. If the activity is beyond national jurisdiction and it's likely to impact within someone's national jurisdiction, there's basically an extra layer of requirements or sort of special status of potentially most affected states that basically have to be involved in the consultation process, have to receive reports, have to be aware of how monitoring is going. So it's sort of like a special requirement for consultation. So that was very much a topic for discussion in the treaty, is what about when the impacts cross those borders, is there still an EIA requirement? So that's where we ended up.
Thank you, Beth, for these like insights that we wouldn't know otherwise. But yeah, just related also to the EIA, and there's also some questions here on the liability and the risk regime of BBNJ and also ISA, briefly the minor issues. So could you shed light more on like what came about on the liability regime? Was there like any discussion on compensation or for any like activities or around like contractors or actors within those areas? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe I'll go with Beth first.
Yeah.
Then
time is short, so I would direct you to my recent article, Liability in the BBNJ Agreement. But I'll sum it up this way. So liability was discussed early on in the preparatory committee and a couple of times in the early sessions, but it really dropped off the radar and was not included in the draft text. I think this is a problem because UNCLOS Article 235 requires the further development of liability provisions in later agreements. The BBNJ does not make good on that requirement, and in my opinion, is not therefore fully consistent with UNCLOS. But the article came out, other people were discussing it. CARICOM, the Caribbean community, proposed adding an additional part on liability in the agreement, but it was basically too late, couldn't get consensus. So what we ended up with was a line in the preamble about recognizing, the need to develop liability mechanisms. So that is something that the COP could take on and further develop specific requirements for liability. But essentially, the BBNJ treaty we got does not go beyond UNCLOS when it comes to liability and responsibility.
okay, so let's look at the COP and how it deals with that matter. Pradeep?
Yeah, no, in the case of the International Seabed Authority, there is a liability regime, but it's still very open. What actually constitute liability? How do we establish when damage has occurred? Do we tie that to serious harm to the marine environment, which is a higher threshold, or do we, tie it to a lower harm of like, harmful effects, essentially, which are, two sort of different terms used in part 11 of the convention. So there's basically no agreement at the moment on where do we tie liability. States are still discussing the thresholds to meet serious harm and the thresholds to meet harmful effects. I think it would be resolved through the exploitation regulations, but we're still far from getting anywhere near that. But there are other sort of mechanisms, requirements for insurance, requirements for an environmental performance guarantee that is basically tied to the obligations of contractors. And there's also an environmental compensation fund that has been established pursuant to the advisory opinion that was delivered by the tribunal in 2011. So essentially to cover an instance where a contractor is liable for damage, but is for any reason unable to pay, for example, if it has gone bankrupt or something like that, then there is access to an environmental compensation fund in order to compensate for such damage. But there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of liability, including to sort of clear the blurry lines between liability of a contractor and liability of a state that sponsors a contractor and how that works.
Just quickly following on to that discussion, there's an interesting question here on liability and all other disputes that might arise, like, for example, challenging EIA decisions. Is it clear under the regime that we have, under Law of the Sea Convention, under the ISA, what court would hear this challenge? Or is it something that we have not really discussed yet? Or
Yeah, so for EIAs, one of the remaining controversies was the idea of a call-in mechanism, which basically is this exact scenario where an EIA was done and an activity was authorized and you disagree with the decision. And essentially, it triggers additional kind of review and recommendations through the scientific and technical body, and I believe also the CUP. So there is sort of an avenue for that. In terms of disputes in general, there is a dispute settlement provision in the BBNJ agreement, and it's essentially a rehashing of what's in UNCLOS. Same options: the International Court of Justice, the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, arbitration, or a special panel of technical experts, depending on the nature of the dispute. It was just written in such a way that non-members of UNCLOS could also participate in those options.
Right. Thanks, Beth. And just because this is just one of the last questions, or the last question, because it's the context of Southeast Asia, there were a lot of observations from the question box on really having equitable access and benefit sharing of the resources from the areas beyond national jurisdiction, from the mineral resources, the abyssal plains, all those things. Like, what would be your main takeaways and how these instruments have considered the equitable benefit sharing? If you could just allay to all our audience here, what are the specific provisions and what are the conversations that happen there?
Yeah, maybe I can start with what's being discussed at the ISA at the moment, and it's quite worrying, I would say, is that we really haven't had this conversation yet. We've only had some draft reports that have been prepared, but we haven't debated an equitable mechanism for the sharing of benefits. And this is quite concerning because, if the regulations are adopted and mining activities can commence, or if it falls under this window of exception where I just mentioned in my presentation that mining activities could, in theory, occur without the regulations, and there is no agreement on how the benefits are going to be shared. Now, that's I guess, an issue that we need to sort of consider, because perhaps, mining activities would not be beneficial if there are no tangible or significant amounts of benefits or financial benefits that could be distributed. At the moment, there are some, calculations, for example, by the African group countries, where they predict something like between 50,000 to 100,000 a year, which for them doesn't make sense if we are going to take on the burdens of deep seabed mining activities to happen, if indeed states get something like a trivial amount every year. So I think it's very important, and some states have already started to sort of request the ISA to expedite this discussion on benefit sharing and how these benefits are going to be distributed, because that would influence their decision on whether or not the regulation should be adopted and mining activity should commence. And a very quick final point on that is that it's not just about, receiving this benefits for it, but as I mentioned in my presentation, there's also the responsibility for the ISA to actually compensate terrestrial mining developing countries for adverse economic impacts on their economies. So deep seabed mining could affect their earnings, and the ISA would have to compensate them from the money that it receives, which means even lesser money to distribute. And so indeed, many topics that we need to cover under equitable benefit sharing. And it's quite worrying that we haven't really debated this in both the political organs, the council and the assembly of the ISA.
Thanks really for flagging those. And Beth?
Whether the benefit sharing in the BBNJ is fair and equitable definitely depends on who you ask and what they're thinking about. I would just invite folks to look at the final treaty text, which is available on the front page of the BBNJ website. Article 11 is titled Fair and Equitable Sharing of Benefits, and it goes over monetary provisions for monetary benefit sharing, but also forms of non-monetary benefit sharing, stuff like access to samples, involvement in research activities, etc. That article, plus the capacity building and technology transfer section, are really where we're supposed to be contributing to or investing in fair and equitable benefit sharing. And I think I have to leave it at that, because otherwise there's far too much detail. But that is the first place to look when you're asking yourself this question.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Beth and Pradeep. But before we close this program, I'd like to give you some time to share your final thoughts and final points on this issue, BBNJ and deep seabed mining, and key takeaways for all our audience here. So, would like to go first? Final messages? Freddie? Oh, Beth, go ahead.
Okay, well, as a key takeaway, we can't stop paying attention to what's going to happen with the BB&J regime. There's lots more to come, and what the COP does and does not do will really affect whether or not the BB&J agreement achieves its goals of conservation and sustainable use. The other closing point I wanted to make is just to thank the Southeast Asian states for their contribution to the BB&J treaty. Throughout the negotiations, states like Vietnam, the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand were particularly active. And at least in the open sessions, I often found their contributions to be particularly incisive and persuasive and reactive too, really being involved in the continuing discussion. And so from my perspective as an academic in the back of the room, the Southeast Asian states really did make this treaty better. And so I hope that, there's a continuing commitment to make its implementation as good as possible as well.
Thank you very much, Beth. And Pradeep.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, it's a critical point in time as we're negotiating the regulations and there is pressure to adopt them as soon as possible at the ISA. And so, I guess my parting views would be, let's get more involved. Let's get more countries into the debate. Let's hear more different viewpoints and concerns. And so particularly also from Southeast Asian countries, with the exception of Singapore and to some extent Indonesia, we are relatively missing from the scene. And I think it's time for us to sort of come back and contribute, and also bring, as Beth mentioned, the ideals and aspirations from BB&J and take it to the floor at the International Seabed Authority to ensure coherence and I guess to ensure that the regulations that are adopted at the ISA is indeed for the benefit of humankind as a whole and in everyone's best interests. Thanks.
Excellent points, Matt and Pradeep. Thank you for those key takeaways, and that's what we're trying to do here, trying to get everyone involved, and we're very happy that Southeast Asian audience is also quite interested in all these issues as well. So at this point, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Beth, Pradeep, Andreas, also Nachu, for their fantastic presentations and their insights on this issue. And at this point, we're closing the floor for the questions and closing the program. But I'd like to thank the panel and everyone in the audience for participating. The panel in particular, you've shown us that this historic ocean treaty, what it means for the globally and in the context of Southeast Asia, and we look forward to how it plays out further to improve global environmental and ocean governance in areas beyond national jurisdiction. To all our panelists, thank you very much, and to all our participants in today's webinar, thank you for joining us. Again, this has been Rocky Guzman from REL. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon, and we hope to see you in the next one. Bye, all.